Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Brian Calley, the CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Communications. I'd like to welcome one of our new members, Albrecht Engineering out of Birmingham. So thank you to Chad Albrecht and his team. And we are welcoming them on behalf of our sponsor, Consumers Credit Union. Check them out at consumerscu.org. We have a pretty full show for you today, and we're going to jump right in with one of our special guests, Brian.
All right, very good. Well, we're pleased to have a guest today from Warner, who's been a great law firm that's been a great partner with SBAM and a lot of work that we've done, supporters of our leadership council. Great work, great lawyers that are part of it, including newly minted partner Carly Zagaroli. And Carly, thanks for joining us today. Our audience members would know from a few weeks ago when we told them about a change in the Supreme Court standard or precedent of an overturning of a precedent that was maybe 20 years old for the open and obvious standard. And so I thought I would ask you first to just maybe cover what does that mean as a practical matter for the Supreme Court to have overturned this precedent? What was overturned and what does it mean?
Hi, Brian. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and that's a great question. So the Michigan Supreme Court sits at the top of the courts in the state of Michigan. And so when the Michigan Supreme Court makes a decision such as this one, where they're overturning a doctrine, what that means is that all of the lower courts, including the trial courts, where you're going to see this really have a more significant impact, need to follow what the Michigan Supreme Court tells them, what to do. So in overturning the application of this open and obvious doctrine, and giving a different way to take a look at this issue, all of those lower courts and the lawyers that are assisting the businesses need to follow that new law. So that's generally what happens when the Michigan Supreme Court does something like this. So
in the open and obvious standard itself, then we know from the coverage and some of the discussion around it has to do, it's kind of like I've heard it referred to as the slip and fall cases that this would impact. So what does open and obvious mean?
All right. So generally, and I'm going to put it as what open and obvious meant, so then we can talk about what it means now. So yes, there was a case, it's called Lugo, and it's been in place since 2001. And it talked about the open and obvious doctrine. And basically, business owners, land possessors, they owe a duty to individuals who are considered invitees. And invitees are people who come onto your property, a land possessor's property, for a business purpose. So think of customers, if you're a retail business, event attendees or contractors. And so if someone comes onto your property and let's say they were injured, they fell into a pothole, there was a cord that was running across the floor, they slipped on and they injured themselves. If they sued and they were injured, what businesses could do is they could say, look, that condition was so open and obvious that I did not owe a duty to maintain that condition or warn this person that was there. It was they could have seen it and they could have avoided it. So that's what the open and obvious doctrine was. And then Lugo pretty much said, like a generic pothole, that's an open and obvious condition. It set out parameters, and there could be an exception to this if there were special conditions to an open and obvious, or to a condition on the land. So only if a business owner could be liable if it had special conditions, like if it's a 30-foot deep pit that someone could fall into and they could be injured severely, or it could result in death, or if it was effectively unavoidable, where they had to go through the condition. There's no other way to get around it. They had to go through this condition and they could hurt themselves. So all of that went away. And so the open and obvious doctrine as we know it is no longer there.
So in that, what presumably what that would mean is that that it would be easier than to, or let me put it from the business owner perspective side, more difficult to defend in the case of somebody, even if somebody was injured because of something that was open and obvious, they should have known, they should have been able to see it. I was actually at a, I was traveling. It didn't happen to be in Michigan, but I was in a hotel over the weekend, and there's a fireplace in the hotel, and there was on that fireplace is hot was a big sign across the top of it, which, like, fire's in the name of this thing. Fire's hot. Like, that seems pretty obvious, and yet there was a big. It was a beautiful looking fixture made ugly by this big sign that was a warning that in fact fireplaces are hot, and so it was. You know, I'm kind of imagining, like, what does a business do? I mean, are we in a position where just like notices, signs, and things are going to need to be posted on a more regular basis, or to point out things that previously would have just been obvious, but now to protect themselves, the business owner might need to post a sign warning that snow is slippery or fire is hot?
Yeah, so one of the downsides of this is that all of this case law that kind of had these parameters of how business owners should maintain their properties is gone. And so at this point right now, it'd be prudent for businesses and property owners to really double down on maintaining their premises, and that can look, it can be different things for different businesses. Does that mean more sweeps that you're doing? If if you're a retailer and you have things in your business where it can fall and spill, is that just walking down aisles, making sure everything is okay? Is it, sitting down and thinking about what could be dangerous to somebody? Do we need to put up a warning sign? Do we need to have a procedure where if something happens, we have to put up barriers? How often are we going to have people come and take a look at our parking lots? So it's really going to be, at this point, businesses are going to have to kind of step up a little bit more in that, because we're not quite sure how the lower courts are going to handle this, this new opinion, and it's going to take some time. It's going to take some time for that to get fleshed out a bit. Yeah,
so really a new body of case law needs to be experienced,
right? Yeah.
And as we go through that, so in the meantime, I think you make a good point. I'm thinking in terms of, like, it's snowing outside and a sign saying, while it's snowing, even though we're going to remove the snow when it's done, like, so there's some things that just, it's a danger that's going to be there periodically in Michigan through the winter, is that it snows sometimes. But in other cases, maybe just kind of going the extra mile to barricade or rectify things that could be dangerous if a person is absent-minded or just not paying attention, that's now the responsibility of the business owner.
Yeah, at this point, unfortunately, that's a downside where we just don't know. It's going to take it's going to take different facts in front of the courts to figure out how to navigate that. So for now, it's coming up with what could it be that might be a dangerous condition to someone that comes on to the property. And with that, there's other ramifications. I mean, since there's no case law on this, these cases are going to have to go through the courts, meaning that more of them are going to go to trial than before. And knowing that some of these cases are going to go to trial, that's going to be an uptick in these types of cases. If there's an uptick in the risk of lawsuits against business and property owners, insurance, you have to think about that. Most businesses have, or at least I hope, I'm an insurance attorney, so I hope most businesses have commercial property insurance. Within those insurance policies, there's liability sections for when individuals are injured on your property. Very likely to see an increase in those premiums because it's just, instead of doing an individual basis analysis with each business, it's generally probably just going to be baseline raise of premiums, because the risk is higher for those types of lawsuits now.
Yeah, and you bring up an excellent point, and a very practical follow-up then to this discussion would be for those of you who are watching and own a business. Naturally, I'd hope that you would have insurance, but a review of what you actually do have, what the coverage levels are, and whether or not that's appropriate, given that the incentive and the likelihood of those prevailing in lawsuits against you is likely higher, that given the change that just made its way through the court. Carly, thank you so much for joining us today, for lending your expertise and breaking down a Supreme Court case in bite-sized chunks here that our non-lawyer business owners could take away with some insight on an additional risk that they now face that a month ago probably wasn't on many of their minds.
Yep. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
All right, so we have quite a few topics left to cover. So again, thank you, Carly, for helping our members understand this new issue. But let's talk unemployment numbers, Brian. Michigan released the recent numbers, or latest numbers last week. How are things going?
Yeah, generally pretty good. I mean, we saw the unemployment rate, which is low, stayed unchanged, so 3.6%. And for Michigan, if you look over Michigan's history, below 4% is more the exception to the rule. So it's a very low unemployment rate. And that's not new. It's been pretty low. Is workforce shortages. So the number of people unemployed has been low when there's both shortages and demand for people. What I found most encouraging, though, about these numbers is that there was an increase in the workforce in Michigan. The total, this is not the participation rate, but the number of people in the workforce increased by 23,000. And so that's attracting more people into the workforce. And you see wages that are rising, and a lot of demand for people, and people getting back in. So I thought, it's always, the low unemployment rate is always something that's kind of the headline of it, but underneath those numbers, the fact that 23,000 more people got into the workforce was the most encouraging part. And of that 23,000, 22,000 got back in the workforce for a specific job. In other words, they got back and are employed. And then 1,000 who decided that they're getting back in the workforce and are not yet employed. We've seen sometimes the unemployment rate is a function of all of these things that are moving. So sometimes people get back in the workforce, but they don't have a job yet. They count as unemployed. When they're not looking for a job, they don't count as unemployed. In this case, almost everybody who got back into the workforce was immediately employed, which tells me that they were attracted back into the workforce for a specific job, as opposed to got back in to do job hunting.
And what's not low is American credit card debt. So we're seeing credit card debt now at an all-time high, and this is kind of following a few years of people having excess cash on hand. Yeah, so
the story of the pandemic, with all the pandemic level support, federal government giving out a lot of extra money, was that people had higher savings and dropping and lower debt over the time period since the pandemic. But credit card debt has been steadily rising. And for the first time ever, it reached over $1 trillion. So US, American citizens, their credit card debt surpassed $1 trillion for the first time this summer in 2023. So, and that comes from a report from the Federal Reserve Bank in Detroit, or I'm sorry, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So these are the official stats banks report in, and so it's high debt. Credit card balances rose by 144 billion from June 22, the same time last year, until June 23. So that's a pretty substantial increase, more than 15% increase in overall credit card debt by Americans since then. It was really, starting last year was when it was starting to get pretty high. So the fact that it has risen I thought it might make sense. This might be using a little bit of artistic license, but the idea that debt is rising. We also see home equity line of credit debt rising as well. Not as certainly nowhere near all-time highs. Credit card debt tends to rise faster than other kinds of debt, but we see that on the rise now. We see credit card debt heading all-time high, and we see people getting back in the workforce. So maybe there's some connection between these things that as folks have faced higher prices and savings not going as far as they have in the past, that debt level is rising and more people are entering it back into the workforce. And given high prices and rising debt, it kind of makes sense.
All right, let's talk about the auto industry. First up is the UAW, who continues to make headlines with tough words for the president. Again, we've covered this story many times on the briefing. What's the latest? Yeah,
this is going to be a fascinating story. Michigan has a lot at stake. Our economy overall has a lot at stake with just this confrontation that's brewing and the possibility of strikes within the automotive, our big three. What Shawn Fain, the new leader of the UAW, said that President Joe Biden and Democrats need to do more to support the United Auto Workers fight for higher wages at battery plants, and this is, that's not, of course they would say that, but there's an or else, or they'll be vulnerable to claims that electric vehicles are destroying good paying auto jobs. And we kind of see this happening in Michigan, where there's big investments in one area, and then either disinvestment in other areas or planned disinvestment in other areas. And so what the UAW is really concerned about here is that, everybody's pushing toward this future of electric vehicles, but there's some concern that all these incentives and things that the federal government and the state government are doing, they don't come with strings attached, that they maintain overall employment, that these other jobs are going away. But he went a little further when he said, because when he talked about this vulnerability, he was talking about Donald Trump in Trump's anti-electric vehicle rhetoric. And that is, and so to lay it out and say, hey, you've got this vulnerability is one thing, but the juxtaposition with Donald Trump, I think, brings it to a whole different level of kind of political interplay here, where the UAW is saying, hey, President Biden, you better pay attention to this, because Donald Trump is more attuned or more aligned than you on some of these issues, at least as the membership of the organization is concerned. So just as an example, Trump had warned the EV agenda and warning the transition to electric cars will, quote, decimate auto jobs. And so a quote from Shawn Fain: I have cautioned everybody in Washington, D.C. that they better understand one thing: our workers' experience right now with this EV transition is not a good thing. Continuing the quote: so when somebody else comes along and says, get ready to watch your jobs disappear, that's going to resonate. And the get ready to see your jobs disappear is Shawn Fain quoting Donald Trump. Politics is become so unpredictable these days that former old alliances don't look the same as they did before, and so I think it's just noteworthy here that a union would be leveraging Donald Trump against a Democratic president. I've never seen anything like that before, and it just shows you the type of political times that we're in today are very very different than the old alliances of days past.
Now, speaking about a potential strike, what are some of the steps that Ford is taking to prepare?
Yeah, I was actually kind of surprised at some of the reports I had read in preparing. So Ford is preparing white collar workers to do blue collar jobs in case of a UAW strike. So like the idea of cross training or training those who are doing the like the office operations to run the lines in the event of a strike. That's I think that's a pretty good indication that a strike is viewed as a credible threat. Like this is something that might happen. And given what's been laid out by the UAW in terms of demands, going to a 32-hour work week, 47% increase in wages, going back to defined benefit to like traditional pension plans. There's so many different aspects that the automotive companies literally could not say yes to, but laid out as absolute demands. A strike does seem very. It's hard to imagine how you head it off at this point, given how public the demands are and how far outside of anything that the automotive companies could do without bankrupting themselves. So Ford's taking it very seriously, apparently, including having their salaried workers prepared to run the line. So that's yet another indication that this is that the possibility of a widespread strike of the automotive industry here in this country is a very real possibility.
And with that possibility, the Anderson Economic Group put some dollar figures together on what that strike would potentially cost the economy. So what's the number?
Yeah, strike on Detroit's big three automakers. There's 143,000 UAW members. The total economic loss, according to the Anderson Economic Group, would be $5 billion within 10 days, $5 billion within 10 days. So a massive cost. You can't like shut things down and then just get them back going again. And supply chains and the way that they work is that the things have to happen in order. And when you stop part of it, then there's a domino effect across of other things. So you can't just turn back on this part and have all the other dominoes stand up automatically. It's it takes a lot of time to get it back going. The costs really are pretty big. So it's something that that I think would likely, well, I know it hit Michigan harder in terms of the overall, that ripple effect on the rest of the economy would of course hit here in Michigan harder than other places around the country. But it's something that the whole country would feel for sure. And really one of the reasons I think why the union leadership is feeling very confident is that they know they've got a lot of leverage. They know this will cause a lot of damage if they were to move forward with the strike, and it really does appear as though they're setting up to do just that. And by making demands that so explicitly public and demands that couldn't possibly be agreed to, it kind of forces the discussion into that strike decision, which so far to the point where the Ford is looking at getting their salaried workers on the lines. I mean, that's a pretty extraordinary step.
All right, let's shift gears just a little bit to the stock market. Seems that there's still some jitters with the U.S. stock market, even though we've had some positive news lately. So what insight do you have as to why investors are worried? Yeah,
there seems to be, we talked a little bit about this a few weeks ago, and a few of the things that why the investors were feeling a bit jittery. But one of the big items out there is actually what's going on in China. The economic performance of China is different than it has been in the past. And even though generally speaking, we think, well, U.S. economy is could benefit from China not dominating so much of the growth like they have had, so much of the growth that they've been responsible for in the global economy over the last few years. There's this downbeat data coming out of China in terms of their economic performance is something that it won't be or can't be just contained there. So I think that there is some concern about what type of an impact this would have on the global economy, which of course we are part of. Lower than expected industrial production, retail sales out of the country slowed. There was a drop in their exports, and so this, and then their GDP actually is not. They've outpaced the United States for a long time, but they're not right now, and it's a function of theirs being lower. So I think that there's a it's not that it's a contraction happening, it's more slowing, but it's just so unusual for pre-pandemic times that I think that investors around the globe are really not exactly sure what to do with it. And so I think part of these jitters, in addition to some of the other things that we had talked about before, especially that downgrade of the bond rating for the United States federal government that Fitch did, and then some of the banks the bigger banks that they had downgraded and overall downgraded the outlook for the financial institution industry. All of those things are kind of piling up and just creating uncertainty. And it's in the face of actually economic data that's not too bad here in this country. So in some cases, it's good. So still some mixed signals, still concerns about both rising interest rates and inflation, core inflation especially. But generally speaking, the trend's going in the right direction. So still jittery out there. It's been kind of a rough month on the stock market, and we'll see whether or not there's something really needs to change. I think the conversation for that to really turn around.
All right, let's wrap up with an update on what we're calling problematic legislation. There are many pieces of legislation that have been proposed for the last, several months now, and I'm going to drop a link into the chat so that everybody can kind of have a summary of what we're talking about here. But Brian, what are you still worried about in terms of these pieces of legislation, and are there any that you have, are feeling positive about?
We have been working over the summer, one-on-one meetings. Our members, people that are highly engaged with SBAM, that are running small businesses, that are connecting with their local representatives and senators. We've got SBAM staff that's working in tandem with other business organizations that we team up with. And what I consider an education mode. This is not a pound your fist on the table, like, what were you thinking type of a thing, but to go over legislation and say, okay, here's what's proposed, and we'd like to share with you what that means for small business. And to be pro small business, you really need to oppose this legislation. And so there are several, I do feel that there's a lot of good momentum in our direction where people are saying, we're representatives, including those who control the agenda, Democrats in the House and the Senate, that are kind of backing off on some of these proposals that we're most concerned about. So there's an effort nationwide to try to eliminate or severely restrict independent contractors. I think there's a growing list of legislators that are concerned about the ramifications of that. And so I'm feeling pretty good about this effort to inform the process of the dangers of this proposal. I think it's generally going pretty well. The pay transparency bills, the ones that require disclosure of what everybody makes in your small business to everybody on the team, that seems to be something that's running into some headwinds as well. Predictive scheduling, where retail, hotels, and restaurants would have to guarantee a schedule 2 weeks in advance and have to pay double time for changes in that schedule. That looks like it's hitting some headwinds as well. In other words, we're meeting with representatives and senators, and they are sympathetic and taking to heart the negative impact this would have, and indicating that they don't support it. So I'm feeling actually pretty good on those. And the direction of that, or people moving away from support. But that's not to say that all concerns have gone away. For those of you who are reaching out to people and sharing your opinions, please continue to do that. This fall, there'll be a lot of things that are happening. We cannot afford to take the foot off the gas. We need to continue to advocate on these things. The one that I'm pretty concerned about, that I've heard a lot of chatter, is this idea of creating a paid leave benefit that goes beyond. We've got the one that's in court right now. Remember, there's a paid sick leave case in court, and if the Supreme Court overturns the 2018 compromise, it will increase the amount of paid sick leave that you have to have, including to the part-time employees. That's one thing that's in the courts, but in the legislature, there's a proposal that would create essentially a paid family medical leave benefit in Michigan, where they would assess employers to populate a fund, or to fund an account that employees could then draw off from when they had a family medical leave. So that, while it's not clear what form that would take, there's enough chatter to where that's really moved up the list of concerns of a potential new mandated benefit that the government is considering putting in place for small business owners to have to follow. So lots to keep track of. We've got summaries on all those and more. And please do take a look at that list. It's written hopefully in a way that's very direct and understandable, not legalese. So that when you're in a place where you can communicate with a legislator, please do let them know which of those items would harm your business. Let them know that it would harm their business, and ask them to support you, to be pro small business. Most of them say they are. By voting no on these proposals would be a good way for them to prove it.
All right, well, thanks for the update. I know you and our team have been hard at work and fighting for small businesses. So we'll keep everybody updated as we know more. That is all we have today. Enjoy your week, and we will be back here next Monday at 3 p.m.
Thanks, everybody. See you next week.